There is perhaps no citing and referencing style guide used more often in academia than the one established by the American Psychological Association, commonly referred to as APA. Its rules for creating a reference entry are particularly complicated. The purpose of this video is to give students a foundational understanding of how to structure a reference entry in APA style and the basic formatting guidelines that are used in their reference page. In order to provide a strong foundational understanding of how to structure a reference page in APA style, we've broken down the reference page into three categories. First, we're going to cover sequencing. Second, we'll cover formatting. And third, we'll cover structure. The first step to being able to create a reference entry is understanding how to sequence the information that will be presented in the reference entry. Before going into detail on how to sequence a reference entry, let's take a look at the basic sequencing structure that each reference entry should conform to. We'll always begin with authorship. This is usually in the form of the author's name. This is followed by the date of publication, then the title of the work, and finally a retrieval date. Obviously, when we're dealing with different kinds of works, such as journal articles and books, there are more subtle nuances to the sequence. So let's take a look at a couple of broad examples. Let's take a look at how to sequence the information when we're creating a reference entry for an article. First, we begin with the author. This is followed by the date, and then the article title. Articles are typically found in a journal, newspaper, or magazine, so this will go next. If there is a volume and issue number, we'll have the volume issue number. This will be followed by the page range, and then finally, assuming that it's an electronic source, the electronic location. Let's take a look at how we would sequence a reference entry for a book chapter. We'll again begin with the author and the date of publication. This will be followed by the chapter title. If the book had editors, they will go after the chapter title. This will be followed by the title of the book. If the book was an edition other than the first or one in a volume, we will include those numbers as well. And then the page range followed by the publisher or electronic location if it was an ebook. Now the two outlines we've just provided are quite broad. Because there are so many different kinds of entries that you would have to create, and they each have different nuances, we're going to create some follow-up videos that will go over specific examples. These are meant as an overall guide in your general practice, so be sure to apply these broad examples whenever you're creating a reference entry. In addition to understanding how to sequence the information in a reference entry, it is equally critical to understand how to format that information. When it comes to formatting the information presented in a reference entry, there are three key things we want to look at: authors' names, capitalization, and italicization. Formatting names. The first thing we're going to do is invert the author's names. This means that the surname or family name is going to come first. We're going to close out the surname with a comma, and then we'll introduce the initials of any other names or initials that were included in publication, and those will be put in sequential order. Now, this sounds simple, but let's take a look at a few examples so that we can understand how to put this in practice and identify some of the potential nuances that may confuse these rules. Let's assume you're creating a reference entry for celebrated American author Toni Morrison. Her published name is Toni Morrison. Therefore, in the AP format, we're going to invert that and bring her family name or surname first, Morrison, comma, and then we're going to initialize any other names that were included in the publication. Here, it's simply T period. Now keep in mind, we do not include the middle names if they're not part of the published names. Let's assume that you're creating a reference entry for a novel in the Game of Thrones series. The published name for authorship would be George R.R. Martin, and this is a little more complicated than Toni Morrison as we have some initials. but the structure is the same. We bring the surname forward, Martin, comma, and then we include the initials of any names or initials that are included in publication. So here we have G period, R period, R period. A special note here, be sure to include a space in between the initials. Here you'll see we have G period space, R period space. Do not put them together. In some cases, we might find that the given name or first name is hyphenated. In this case, we'll include both names with the hyphen. Here, the published name might be Mary-Kate Olson. The APA format will be Olson, comma, M period dash K period. In this case, there's no space between the initials. They all go together. Suffixes and titles. What do we include and what do we not include? Some students get confused with suffixes and titles such as senior and doctor. What we will include the suffixes such as junior, senior, and the third because they are part of the name. What do we not include? Titles such as doctor, lord, or lady, because these are not actually part of the name. Let's assume that we're creating a reference entry for Dr. Stephen Strange. The published name might have included the title, Dr. Stephen Strange. However, we will not include the word doctor in the APA format. That will simply be the surname and initial, Strange, comma, S period. Perhaps you're creating a reference entry for Kurt Vonnegut Jr. That's the published name. The APA format would go as follows, Vonnegut, comma, K period, comma, junior. As you can see, the suffixes such as junior, senior, or the third will go at the end. Special note, make sure we put a comma before the suffix. If you have analyzed the rhetorical devices in one of Dr. Martin Luther King's famous speeches, the published name might go as follows, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In this case, we have both the title, Doctor, and the suffix junior at play. For the APA formatted version of the name, we'll only include the suffix King, comma, ML Jr. In some instances, you may be recognizing an organization or a company as an author. In such cases, there are two things you want to consider. First, do not use abbreviations or initializations. We want to use the organization or company's full name. Second, use the organization's use of capitalization. There are some instances where the capitalization may be irregular, but you still have to conform to the way they spell their name. For example, you may have gotten information from a company's website. In this case, the company's name is BAPE. They stylize their name by capitalizing all four letters. Therefore, when you present it in your reference, you have to conform to their capitalization rules rather than using conventional capitalization rules. Alternately, you may be citing a group such as Blackpink. They likewise stylize their name with all caps, so you would follow the same pattern. The same rule applies to authors as well. For example, activist and author Bell Hooks chooses to lowercase both her given name and her surname, in part to differentiate herself from her grandmother, with whom she shares a name, and in part to discourage people from putting an emphasis on her as an individual and focus on her work instead. In this case, we would format the reference entry as follows, Hooks, comma, B period, with both a lowercase h and a lowercase b. It's critical to do this so that we honor the choices that the author makes and represent them in the way that they wish to be represented. In APA style, most articles are written by more than one person. Thus, it's important to understand how to link names in the reference entry. APA has two different sets of rules, one for 2 to 20 authors and another for more than 20 authors. Let's take a look at how we would format 2 to 20 authors. In this case, APA prescribes that all 20 authors' names be included. A comma will be added after the final initial of a name when introducing a new name. An ampersand, the and symbol, will precede the last name, and the last name will be closed with a period as the name otherwise would be. Let's take a look at an example. Here we got the first name, West, K period. This is closed out with a comma because we're introducing another name, Kardashian, K period. We have another comma because we're introducing another name. That name happens to be the last name, so it's also preceded by the ampersand. Then we have Jenner, K period. In some rare cases, there may be more than 20 names accredited with authorship. We're still going to list 20 names, however, the format will be slightly different. First, we're going to list the first 19 names in conformance with the way we just described. Then, after the 19th name, we're going to introduce an ellipsis. This will be followed by the final name that is given authorship. Let's take a look at an example. Here, all of the Avengers decided to get together to write a journal article, and there's far more than 20. So we're going to list the first 19 names and the last one. We start with our lead author, Stark, T period, and then we have a comma to introduce the next name, Parker, P period, comma. And we continue that pattern all the way up to the 19th name, Summers, S period, comma, introducing the next name. But here's where we introduce our ellipses, the 3 dots. Then we have a space and the final author, Surfer, S period. The 3 ellipses shows the reader that we're passing over information. Now, the 2 most common errors occur at this location. The first issue is that people often put extra spaces in between the punctuation following the 19th name. However, you see in our example here, all that punctuation goes together. S period, comma, dot, dot, dot. Then we have a space before the last name. The other common issue is that people will often put the ampersand or and symbol before that last name, but we don't include this either. When the reader sees the ellipses, they'll know that we're leading into the final name, and we're also going to pass over the ampersand as well as each of the names between the 19th and final name. So just a quick recap for those 2 rules. Do not put spaces between the periods in the ellipses or the preceding punctuation. And do not put the ampersand or and symbol before the final name. Special note. When we're creating a reference entry for an article, we want to make sure that the author's names go in the order they appeared in the publication, not necessarily in alphabetical order. A lot of students assume that because the reference list in its entirety is alphabetized, that the names in the specific entry should also be alphabetized. But what we want to do instead is honor the sequence of names that the authors themselves have decided upon, because this is usually based on the amount of work that each individual author does, and we do not want to undermine that. Capitalization and italicization. APA has specific rules with respect to how to use capitals and italics. So let's go over these in detail. First, we're going to go over the capitalization rules for the titles of articles and books. So what gets capitalized in this context? The first word of a subtitle, any proper names that appear within the title, and initializations and acronyms. Next, we're going to go over the capitalization rules for journals, newspapers, and magazines. Where books and articles have titles, journals, newspapers, and magazines have proper names, like your name and my name. This means they get proper name capitalization, or what APA refers to as title case capitalization. So what doesn't get capitalized in this context? First, we're not going to capitalize articles such as the, a, and an. Likewise, we're not going to capitalize short conjunctions. That means conjunctions that are less than 4 letters. This might include the words and, but, and or. Finally, we're not going to capitalize short prepositions. Again, this means prepositions that are less than 4 letters. In, on, of. That said, we're always going to capitalize the first word, no matter what kind of word it is. The rules for italics are significantly simpler than those for capitalization. What gets italicized? Large works. These are typically seen as containers as they usually have smaller works within them. Books have chapters. Newspapers, magazines, journals have articles. Therefore, a book would be italicized, a chapter within it would not. A newspaper, magazine, or journal's name would be italicized. The articles in those would not be italicized. Now that we understand the sequencing and general formatting associated with a reference page in APA style, we want to understand the structure. With respect to structure, we want to look at three key items: the heading, the sequence, and indentation. Formatting the heading for the reference page in APA style is relatively easy. We simply put the word references at the top. However, there are 4 criteria that we need to follow. First, it needs to be at the top of a fresh page. It needs to be centered. It needs to be capitalized. And it needs to be bolded. This last criteria is new for the 7th edition. When creating a fresh page, many students simply hit the Enter or Return button until they bring the cursor to the top of a fresh page. However, each word processor has a different line count. Therefore, a line that appears on the top of a fresh page for you may not appear at the top of a fresh page for another word processor. To address this, we want to create a page break. You can do this by clicking on the Insert tab in your Word document and then clicking on Page Break, or use a shortcut. If you use an Apple computer, simply hit Command and enter Return at the same time. If you're on a real computer, you can simply hit Control and Enter at the same time. And these shortcuts will create a page break for you automatically. Let's take a look at how to sequence the reference list. Each of the entries will be put in alphabetical order. Works by the same author go in chronological order. This chronological order begins with the works that have no date and then go from the earliest to the most recent publication. If the publication year and author are the same, the works go in alphabetical order by article title. Let's take a look at indentation. APA prescribes that we use the hanging indent for the reference entries. This means that the first line is left aligned, and the lines following it will be indented. However, we do not want to simply hit Enter Tab to create a hanging indent. So why can't we simply hit Enter Tab to create the hanging indent? Well, just as each word processor has a different line count per page, each word processor likewise has a different character count per line. For example, Google Docs typically has more characters per line than a Word document. Up top, we hit Enter Tab after the word of, and this put the subsequent line in the hanging indent format. However, if somebody were to open that up in a Word document, the word of might not fit on that top line and would therefore be pushed to the next line and remain left aligned. Then there would be an empty space followed by an indentation on the next line. The reader will be confused as to why this is not in conformance with APA formatting, and you could lose marks. So how do we create a hanging indent? Well, there is a quick shortcut. If you use an Apple product, you can simply hit the Command button plus the letter T. Again, if you're on a real computer, you can hit the Control button plus the letter T. This will create a hanging indent. If there seems to be some spacing issues with respect to your hanging indent, you can do this the long way through the graphic interface. First, highlight all of your references. Then right-click and select Paragraph. In the indentation section that appears in the pop-up window, select Hanging in the drop-down menu. Make sure that the hanging indent is set at 0.5 inches or 1.27 centimeters, and then select OK. This should put your hanging indent into APA format. You now have the basic foundational knowledge that you need to begin your reference page in APA style. Let's do a quick summary of the key points. First, when sequencing the information in a reference entry, we're going to give preference to authorship, the date of publication, the title of the work, and then its location, which might be the publisher or an e-source. When writing the author's name, we'll lead with the surname, and that will be followed by initials. The names of journals get title case capitalization. This means it's a proper name, so everything gets capitalized except for short conjunctions, short prepositions, and articles such as the, at, and. Article and book titles will get first word capitalization. So the first word of the title, the first word of the subtitle, and then any proper names, initializations, or acronyms that appear in the title. We're going to italicize large works. We're going to alphabetize all of our sources. And with respect to formatting, we're going to use the hanging indent. We will be creating future videos that outline how you can create specific reference entries for items such as books, chapters in books, and journal articles, among others. However, we recognize that APA citing and referencing is a complicated and nuanced process. Thus, if you need support with this, be sure to book an appointment with the Writing Support Desk through My Success. We will be happy to give you the instruction that you need to successfully format your reference page in accordance with APA standards. Be sure to book early though, because our appointments fill up quickly. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.